Boom, 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 doo, doo. Family, it's your favorite queer radio personality, Anna DeShawn here, and it is LGBTQ History Month. And I thought to myself, I'm going to do videos. And then I thought to myself, so is the homie Amanda. Yes, the queer, so why not we come together and do videos together? What's going on, Amanda?
I love it. It was my favorite idea ever. I'm so glad you messaged me.
We're coming together to give you history, and not just the history your mama taught you, okay? This is the history you didn't even know you didn't know. A few videos this month and have a good time, because history isn't flat. History is really this beautiful, complicated, messy thing that we all like to put into a cute little box. But our goal in October is to throw this box up in the air and see where things land. And today we are going to do a video about Matthew Shepard. Family, do you all know who Matthew Shepard is?
So the story that we've all been told about Matthew Shepard is that he was savagely beaten to death by two strangers that he met in a bar, who beat him because they found out he was gay and that he tried to come onto them. That is the story we have all been told. That is likely not the entirety of the truth.
Now, Amanda, I don't even know what you're talking about. How can that be entirely not the truth? Because as far as I'm concerned, since 1998, that has been the said truth. Matthew Shepard, his face, this story was absolutely everywhere. In 1998, I was in high school, and I remember that it was literally everywhere. And this was a time that we didn't necessarily talk about gay things all the time. I mean, Ellen had just come out in 1997, is that right? And and was fired. Let's be clear. This is not like gay-friendly America here. This is pre-marriage equality, right? And so with all that context, this story about this 5'2" white gay man, and this part being hung by a fence like as if he was Jesus, right, was sort of how the story was told, and left to die. That's the story, Amanda. And that's the story. And now we're about to throw the box up in the air because y'all ain't ready for this. I wasn't ready, okay? And now
so it is a very, very complex story that I might actually go more into depth on my own channel. But basically, Aaron McKinney, who is one of the assailants, and Matthew Shepard had a history. Both of them were involved in the methamphetamine community in Laramie and also in neighboring Colorado. So there's just a lot of extenuating factors, background history that were sort of left out of the popular national narrative. But
why do you think that is? Why do you think it was left out?
I think it was left out because for a few reasons. One, Matthew Shepard's friends were rightfully concerned that his death would be buried because he was gay, that the cops would just sort of look the other way, not really worry about it because he was gay. So a lot of them went to the media immediately, framing this as a hate crime. And I'm not sure that conclusion was inaccurate at the time, given that no one knew anything about what had happened. So that is part of it. This also happened at a time when the Clinton administration was deeply embroiled in the Monica Lewinsky scandal and in his potential impeachment. So there were definitely political advantages to turning the country's attention to someone else. And at that time, the queer community was feeling very, very vulnerable. We had just come through sort of the worst part of the AIDS crisis. There was this new drug crisis ticking up that sort of no one was talking about yet. And Matthew Shepard and I are the same age, or we would be if he was still alive. And I remember when I heard about his murder, that visceral fear that that could happen to anybody I knew. So I think there were a lot of reasons that, you know, the media sort of ran away with this very clearly articulated martyrs and villains narrative before anyone really knew anything about what had happened.
And it caught fire rather quickly.
Yes.
Right? I feel like in the context of no social media, right? This is pre-Facebook, and the way in which this story really did take off. I mean, Matthew Shepard was definitely seen as this very ideal, perfect figure. And his mother has been noted as saying that is not who he was. That's not even how he would want to be seen out here in the world. But the way in which we like to tell stories are to try to keep them simple, as if we can't handle the gray area of a situation, that we can't handle there being something in between the angel and the villain, that there could be some nuance and some dirtiness in the midst of the story, which still doesn't negate, right, the evil.
In Stephen Jimenez's book, he talks a lot about the drug culture that Aaron McKinney and Matthew Shepard were both involved in. I think a lot of people, again, unless they lived through it, don't remember how much meth was ravaging the country in the 90s, and especially the queer community, because the queer community had just come out of the AIDS crisis, and now there is this cheap new street drug that makes you feel good, and you know, you can stay up for a few days, and unfortunately the downsides of meth are many, two of which are they make you incredibly careless because you can no longer sort of like appropriately make decisions, and they make you psychotic after a certain amount of time. And so meth was an enormous problem in the country in the 90s, but that was sort of like the very beginning of the meth crisis. And Aaron McKinney and Matthew Shepard, according to Jimenez, and again, like, his book is very well sourced. I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but I do think he makes the case that they were both involved in dealing meth, but that they were dealing for different bosses, kingpins, I don't know, whatever you call the head of where you get your stuff to sell it to other people, like different ones.
Yeah, it was like East Coast, West Coast.
Yeah,
it was
kind
like,
of, because
it was like Tupac and Biggie.
Kind of, because Matthew had moved to Laramie from Denver. So he was connected to like the Denver network. And Denver is, I think, like a 2.5 hour drive from Laramie, Wyoming. Whereas Aaron McKinney had grown up in Wyoming. And so he was embedded with like the more like homegrown network. And so the two of them were connected. There is significant evidence that the two of them knew each other.
Oh yeah.
In the months before Matthew Shepard's murder, and not just knew each other because Laramie's not a very big town and there's only so many drug dealers, and of course you're going to sort of all know each other,
right?
But also that they had an independent relationship. What
kind of relationship, Amanda?
Well, they were like definitely at least partied together. There are many people who went on the record with Jimenez to say that McKinney was a sex worker, and he is what's known as, I believe, a straight trade, which is that he was a straight man doing sex work with other men. But there are also other people who say that Aaron McKinney is bisexual. McKinney has denied that categorically across the board ever since he was arrested, in every interview since he was incarcerated. McKinney has denied that completely. But there are a lot of people who are willing to go on the record to say that Aaron McKinney and Matthew Shepard either worked together as hustlers and or had a sexual relationship with each other at some point.
I mean, that story was never told.
No. You want to know what's the trippiest part about how all of these people are connected and queerness?
You mean it's more trippy than this?
Yeah. So Aaron McKinney had a girlfriend named Kristen Price. Russell Henderson had a girlfriend named Chastity Paisley. Kristen's mother and Chastity's mother were in a long-term relationship together. And Aaron McKinney and Kristen lived with them for a while. So these people were all very connected in a sort of small town way.
So wait, their girlfriends' moms were together?
Yeah.
Amanda, I wasn't ready. I was
I'm
not.
also not ready when I literally like had to pause and be like, did I just read that? And then I was like, oh, maybe he just meant that they were friends. No, they were in a relationship together.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so this very interesting book that the Shepards want nothing to do with, but it is a very interesting, well-researched book that came out, I think 2013, and then once again in 2019.
Yeah, and it's sort of recently republished. It's called The Book of Matt by Stephen Jimenez. And it basically started, so Stephen Jimenez is a journalist and a writer, and the New York Times hired him to do a piece about Matthew Shepard, I think maybe a year after the trial, when basically all the records were unsealed. Because one of the things that happened, because this case was so huge, had so much national import, and like the poor judicial infrastructure of Wyoming had never dealt with any of this before. Like the judge had a panic attack the first time he walked into the courtroom and like saw that it was absolutely like wall to wall reporters. Like
a legitimate panic attack.
Had it because he just couldn't cope, and like the prosecutor had to sort of like take control of the courtroom with the bailiff and like push all, because they were like the reporters weren't staying behind the whatever that rail is called in the courtroom. They were like everywhere. They were like next to the witness stand and like sitting on the prosecutor's desk. They were just like,
wow.
Chaos.
The judge was like, I ain't signed up for this. This is why I moved to Wyoming. I didn't want this much attention. Wow.
Basically.
Wow.
So one of the things that judge did was he sealed all of the records during the trial, and I think that seal didn't expire until like a year after McKinney's sentencing, because the whole thing had already gotten so far away from them that he just put it all under seal to unsuccessfully attempt to like control the hysteria sort of around this case. And so first time Jimenez went to Laramie was when all the records were unsealed, and he thought he was going to just sort of like add some color and texture to the commonly understood story about what happened to Matthew Shepard, right? Two random bigots picked him up in a bar and murdered him. So that's the story he thought he was going to tell. And, Jimenez himself is a gay man. And so, he, like me, was very, like I was at the time, very invested in the story as we understood it about Matthew Shepard. That is not the story he discovered when he got there.
I'm sure he was sick of this story because he said this was supposed to be easy. I came here for an easy story, and I ended up with something with the tangled webs we weave.
Yeah, exactly. And so he spent like 2 years researching it for the New York Times, and then the Times thought the reporting was too volatile. Not that it wasn't reliable or well sourced, but too volatile, so they killed it. But now he's hooked in, right? Because now he's like, wait, what actually happened to Matthew Shepard? I really need to figure this out. He ended up helping to produce an episode of 2020 about, sort of like the real Matthew Shepard, but I think aired in maybe 2004. And was widely, even though it won a couple of it won like the Writers Guild Award for reporting that year, that episode of 2020, but was widely panned by activists, by the queer media, saying that they, were trying to take the gay out of Matthew Shepard's story. They're trying to make it about anything other than homophobia. And, as a person whose entire life is devoted to putting the gay back into history and into our national mythos, like, I can understand why that was the reaction.
Absolutely, because erasure has been the name of the game. When we think about all of our beautiful folks in history, the one thing that consistently is left out is their sexuality or their gender identity or who they loved.
Yep. And we'll find any other reason for why something terrible happened to someone. Like,
come on.
So, and I can remember when that 2020 piece came out, I was also in that camp. I was like, this is ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. But that was before I made it a habit to really deep dive into things that I have that strong a reaction to and like think through whether that's the appropriate reaction. So anyway, did this 2020 piece and then kept researching. And so basically Jimenez spent a decade interviewing more than 100 people, looking
More
at
than
court
100
records,
people?
more than 100 people, like,
Wow.
including Aaron McKinney, Russell Henderson, Kristen Price, Chastity Paisley, like including all of the people closest to this. You know, and like Aaron McKinney is a bit of an unreliable witness in a lot of ways, you know.
I mean, he did
But
commit the crime.
yeah, I mean, and had a history of it, right? Like McKinney was on law enforcement's radar from the time he was a teenager. Like he was a deeply troubled kid who came from a pretty traumatic background. And again, coming from a traumatic background is not an excuse for murdering someone ever, 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 ever. You know, but the thing that really gets me about this story and why I think it's important to talk about, you know, sort of the entirety of the story, at least insofar as we can understand it, is
Yeah.
that this was a devastating intersection of poverty, methamphetamines, sex work, homophobia, like all of these things. You know, it was like 4 trains on a collision course, right? Like there was no way that this couldn't have ended in some sort of horrific tragedy, like whether it was going to be this tragedy or like another sort of similar tragedy. And I think that that's important to talk about, right? And we love to sort of like peel these stories off and like put them in their own little space, because then we don't have to deal with the big messy context that led to that happening. You know, we don't have to talk about how methamphetamines were ravaging Colorado and Wyoming at the time, and how like law enforcement was about 10 years behind in understanding anything about what meth does to communities, how it comes into communities, how to stop it. You know, we don't have to talk about how young queer men get pulled into these underworlds of, you know, drug use and sex work. And I want to be clear that there are plenty of people who do sex work consensually and enthusiastically, and I'm not talking about them. I am talking about people who get pulled into that work as a result of them, you know, getting pulled into drug worlds or, you know, whatever. I think that's there's like consensual and enthusiastic sex work, and then there is what I am talking about, which is just another form of young
Abuse.
men being preyed on and being abused.
Absolutely. And I think that it's so incredibly important that we have context on the whole person, because Matthew Shepard wasn't alone. Matthew Shepard had a really tough time. His mom talks about how he was just getting back to himself after a really like life altering moment.
He was when he was in high school. So Matthew Shepard had a I'm going to say sort of an atypical childhood. His family, when he was in high school, his father was like an oil. He worked for oil companies, but is like a safety person, I think. I can't
in
quite
Saudi
remember.
Arabia, right?
Yeah, and so his family got transferred to Saudi Arabia, which was a difficult place to be in the 90s, even in the sort of like the compounds where they put expats who are just immigrants. Expats are immigrants. So they sent him to a boarding school in Switzerland while they lived in Saudi Arabia, because they thought that would be a better situation for him. On a school trip, because I guess when you go to boarding school in Switzerland, you get to take school trips to Morocco. But on a school trip, he was attacked and brutally essayed by 5 men. And not men related to the school, just he had like left his hotel by himself to like go to the corner store or something very innocuous, and just like wrong place, wrong time. And yeah, and that really screwed him up for a good long time.
And justifiably so. It would screw anybody.
Rightfully so. You know, so he'd like he went to North Carolina, where he was in sort of like a small local college, but also receiving intensive treatment for you know, depression and suicidal ideation and those kinds of things. And then from North Carolina, he was in Denver for a while. And then from Denver, he moved to Laramie to finish his college education at the University of Wyoming. So he had already been on this, I think, a pretty common trajectory for young gay men, even young gay men who come from families that support them, as Matthew Shepard did. Like, he had a difficult relationship with his father, but granted, we're only hearing it from his father's side, but it sounds like the kind of difficult that many teenagers have with the parent of their same gender. Like, a lot of teenage girls fight with their mothers, a lot of teenage boys fight with their father, like sort of that kind of difficulty. But I think that was exacerbated by his mental state, as he was recovering from this horrible, horrible attack. So he'd already been on difficult footing for a good long while by the time he got to Denver. And when he got to Denver, he fell into sort of like the gay party scene, started doing meth in addition to marijuana, which he has, I think, since North Carolina, like, smoked regularly. And then somehow it's a little unclear, but then somehow got into dealing, which, again, not uncommon, especially if you are young and good looking and chipper and, part of a party scene. Then, like,
you're unsuspecting.
Yeah. You're someone who's going to get targeted, right? By people who are like, that dude could move a lot of product for us. So, and then also, at some point, and it's unclear how, because as far as has been reported anyway, he never told his parents or friends how, but he also contracted HIV. So he was HIV positive by the time he moved to Denver, which was a very scary thing to be in 1998.
Yes.
So he was already, in some ways, he had a lot more opportunity and sort of like worldly experience, I think, than Russell Henderson and Aaron McKinney. But in some ways, they also all had sort of very similar paths of trauma and, like, being taken advantage of, and also finding themselves in these situations that were just taking on a life of their own, right? Especially Aaron McKinney, who, again, was like a troubled kid who turned into a troubled teenager who turned into a murderer. So, when I say that it's important to think about the path that Aaron McKinney took, I don't mean because we should have empathy or sympathy for him, but I do think we should acknowledge he was part of a system and part of a pattern that is repeating over and over and over in various parts of this country.
What are the real lessons we can learn from Matthew Shepard's story? And it goes past the box that we talked about earlier. It goes past that. It's seeing the whole picture and what happened afterwards. I mean, I think his parents have really championed his life so that we still talk about Matthew Shepard today because of the Matthew Shepard Foundation and all of the work that they do there. And then also recently, his father appeared in a Netflix documentary called Dads, which I think is one of the straightest things I've ever seen their ideas around. Going fishing, I think, in Oklahoma with other dads of trans young people, and they just decided to go fishing, about one of the straightest things you could possibly do.
One of the things that I really love about Dads and about the fact that it exists at all is that this is a whole bunch of men, a whole bunch of straight men, having honest conversations about how to be good parents and good role models and good men to their queer children. And I think that is so important.
And I think one thing to note here is that these fathers, they knew each other. They all were participating in the Parents for Transgender Equality National Council, which is part of the Human Rights Campaign. So they have been busy doing this work on how to be great dads to their queer kids for a little while. And then they gave these cameras permission to capture the moment. And I think in that, it's just so interesting, right? We have these tragic things that happen in our lives. Time moves on. We try to continue to move forward, honoring their memory. And then something like Dads happens, right? At a time where dads really do need to see other dads caring for their queer kids. And so not anything that anybody in 1998 would have ever thought was possible in a 2023, 2024. And yet it can make such an incredible impact today because
Yeah.
of what happened to Matthew then. And I think that knowing the history brings so much of that into context, and it makes me a little giddy around why queer history is so incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. I think that myths serve a purpose. I think it is absolutely true that Matthew Shepard's death galvanized the country around acknowledging homophobia and advancing gay rights in a way that the country hadn't really galvanized around anything maybe since Emmett Till's murder, right? Because it was kind of like visceral, shocking violence. And so a lot of good came out of the way in which this narrative was shaped. Not just in terms of like legislation that Barack Obama finally signed.
Right.
Spent a decade going through our political system. The Matthew Shepard Foundation does enormous amounts of good work. And so I do think that story served a purpose, but now I think we need to look at the broader context and like what was the whole story, because a lot of those problems still have not been addressed. Like there is still an enormous problem in the queer community, especially now for young trans people.
And then you have this quote by John, what's his name?
Yes,
John
by John
Stolenberg,
who is a journalist and an author. So he wrote in response to the publication of the Book of Matt, keeping Matthew as the poster boy of gay hate crime and ignoring the full tragedy of his story has been the agenda of many gay movement leaders. Ignoring the tragedies of Matthew's life prior to his murder will do nothing to help other young men in our community who were sold for sex, ravaged by drugs, and generally exploited.
And when you read that quote to me, I was like, well, that's it right there. Because we like for the story to be so nice and easy. And we like our victims to be angels, right? Without a blemish. And we want to demonize and villainize, right? That person that has caused all the harm.
Yep.
And I think that it's so incredibly important that we have context on the whole person. Yeah. And that's what we're doing right here. LGBTQ History Month. Anna and Amanda, we digging in to history, the messiness, and all the beautiful things that came out of it. This was the Matthew Shepard edition. We got more coming for you this month, so you just got to stay tuned. This is what we do it right here on E3 Radio.
The conversation is.
I mean, it would be good folly.
Today with Anna and Amanda, learn what a conversation is and how they work.